Okay.
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
So I'm going to, for an hour, if you allow me, well, a bit less than an hour, to talk about assessing multimodal language uses. And I will say some things about designing test tasks that assess such competencies, looking at performances on such tasks, looking at how test takers process such tasks, and also how can we rate performances on such tasks. And I'll start by the very big question, why bother? Why should we be interested in assessing multimodal language uses? And the answer, the fundamental answer to that really is the nature of language use in today's world. Human communication is often multimodal and integrated. What that means is that when we communicate, we don't just use oral and written forms of language, but we also communicate meaning via, for example, gestures, like I'm doing here, via visuals, like you can see on the slide, via spatial awareness, and so on. And a lot of the time, we are also using multiple modes at the same time and integrating them. And in effect, what I'm doing right here, right now, is a perfect example. You can see me, you can see my body language, you can hear me, you see a slide with text you are reading, you see a visual that relates to what I'm talking about and what I'm reading. So this is literally a multimodal integrated form of communication happening here. Now, language use has always been, to some extent, multimodal and integrated. But what we are seeing now in today's age is actually, and how do I, yeah, is actually an enormous increase in those forms of communication. And it has to do also with the technological developments that are happening at the moment. And the result of that is that multimodal integrated language uses really start to prevail. And that has implications, namely for effective communication in social, educational, professional contexts. We actually now need multimodal literacy, and that applies equally to second language speakers. And so as a consequence, we, in recent years, we've seen several scholars make pleas for multimodal second language assessments. And I think Elvis Wagner, in a recent article that is part of a special issue in Language Assessment Quarterly, on multimodal assessment, Elvis Wagner really sums it up quite nicely by linking the relevance of this to our core principles in language testing. And so he says, because the way humans communicate and use language is multimodal, second language assessments should mirror and model that multimodality in language assessment tasks that are used to measure communicative and interactional competence. And that then allows test developers to make more robust validity arguments. So he's linking it to authenticity and to validity, but he goes further. He also says by using assessment tasks that involve multimodal input and potentially also multimodal production, those assessments can have a positive impact on test users as well. So there's further implications, and we're looking at washback and impact. Now, when we look at research so far, actually, Lim and colleagues did a systematic review not so long ago. And what they observed was that what is happening in teaching increasingly in second language teaching is more and more use of multimodal pedagogies and curricula is not reflected in the testing that is happening in those same contexts where that teaching is happening. We see the assessments are typically still very traditional, product-oriented, sort of narrow language dominant kinds of assessment, the way we know them. What they also observed is that in those cases where there is sort of multimodal task use, then the way the performances on those tasks are evaluated, that they still very often do that through means of traditional linguistic performance criteria. And what that then means in effect is that the assessed construct becomes monomodal again. So for example, traditional sort of writing and speaking criteria, but not going beyond that. So monomodal constructs. Of course, I mean, it's more nuanced in reality. I'm painting a bit of black and white picture. And there's some really nice examples of multimodal assessments, particularly in English for academic and specific purposes assessments. But they tend to take the nature more of sort of formative kind of assessments and concern or involve pair or group work, which is, of course, extremely valuable. But that doesn't necessarily help us or isn't necessarily practical for more summative general second language proficiency testing contexts. And there we see a gap to date. Now, if we start thinking about such context, more summative general proficiency testing, some questions that come to mind is, for example, how can we actually elicit multimodal processing in a testing context? And also, how can we do that and develop multimodal tasks when we have fairly limited resources? Because the reality of most people around the world, teachers, test developers, is limited resources. And then if we're successful at that, we generate a performance, but then how do we evaluate that performance so that it measures a multimodal construct? And so this is where Judith and my work comes in, a project that was funded by the British Council. And we're very pleased to share that a first article on that project has appeared in the special issue in LAQ, published just in December. So by all means, have a look at the article if you would like more detail on what I'm going to present here today. Testing multimodal integrated language use. So first of all, we need some sort of device to elicit that kind of performance. So typically we look at task development. And as with any project, we couldn't do it all, so we had to narrow things down. And we made a decision in our project to focus on a task type that we have labeled viewing to write tasks. And in these tasks, as a test taker, you watch a video. Whilst you are watching it, you can take notes. And then when the video is finished, you need to write a particular piece of text based on the information from the video. So that's in a nutshell the kind of task type. As I mentioned, we were keeping in mind that many test developers and teachers around the world have limited resources. So we set out some principles for our task design, and we decided we don't want this to look like a BBC production. We want this to be something that someone can imagine they can also make. And so we restricted ourselves to only using standard soft and hardware packages, only using copyright-free materials. Now, I can also say that we started working on this project. Sorry, if everyone can mute their microphone, please. Thank you. We started working on this project in 2022. This is before, you can't imagine this, or at the time that the first AI became available. So in a way, this is pre-AI work. But as I'll mention later, there are opportunities to do this kind of work with AI potentially as well, AI tools. And then secondly, we also set out some criteria for the content. So what would these tasks be about? What topics would they cover? And we had some criteria to select topics. And so we decided we wanted topics that were generally very accessible, but not overly common knowledge at the same time, because we don't want to test background knowledge, and we need to make sure that the writing is based on the video input and not on people's world knowledge. We needed topics that could have lots of different information points, and something that is concrete enough that you can actually visualize it as well. And of course, we want things to be interesting to our test taker population. So we looked for some inspiration through websites, YouTube videos, media programs, not to actually take existing material, but to get ideas about facts, ideas for topics, and so on. And then with those principles, we started to develop tasks, and we developed two task types. And one is called, well, we have called it viewing to describe tasks. So you see the target language function of describing in there. So how did the task work, this type? As a test taker, you watch a video on how something is made. So how a product, a thing is manufactured. And so the video has an oral explanation of how that product is manufactured. You see some visuals related to that. There's some words, some phrases, some numbers, and so on appearing in the video. And as a test taker, you can play it twice, and you're allowed to take notes. And what we did is we tried to develop 3 versions of the task type, also to see, can we replicate it over multiple versions. So we had one task on how a train carriage is made, one on how contact lenses are made, and one on how instant coffee is made. So you can see these are actually quite day-to-day objects or things, products, but I think very few of us actually have a good idea of how they are produced. And so once they've watched the video, the test taker needs to write a short article that describes that production process of that object. Now, we developed this for a context where learners in the schools had computers, so we administered everything through the software Qualtrics, but there's ways to also do these tasks in an offline manner as well. All our task materials and other materials of the project are freely available online. There's a QR code there for you to make use of the tasks or seek inspiration, and so on. It's there. So to give you a bit more of an insight of what to imagine for the input, I'm going to play a little excerpt of a viewing to describe task. There's no time to play the full excerpt, but you'll get the idea from just a snapshot. So, and let me know if the audio. Yeah. Okay, so that gave you some idea. The video continues, obviously, in practice. So once they've watched the video, they moved on to a writing screen where we repeated the key instructions for the writing text, and they could see how much time they had, how many words they had written already as well. So that's the viewing to describe task. Then a second type of task we developed were viewing to compare and contrast tasks. And so in this case, a test taker watches a video cast, like a podcast, but with a video, in which they see two experts who discuss a specific topic. And as they see the experts talking, they also see visuals like graphs and so on. Again, the video can be played twice, and test takers can take notes. So we developed 3 versions again of the task. So one in which there's 2 experts, so-called experts, obviously, 2 experts talking about commercial space travel. Another one where they talk about whether zoos should still exist, and a third one on the topic of giving up income. Yes. And then after watching the video, they need to write a short report in which they compare and contrast the 2 experts' opinions. So it's important here to emphasize a test taker doesn't give their own opinion, but what they need to do is compare and contrast what those 2 experts were saying about the topic. So again, this is a way to avoid that they can use their background knowledge to write. And so I'll also play an excerpt of this task. And so again, the video continues. As you can see, these are definitely not professional actors. And one other thing I want to point out as well is that the instructions were both presented on screen and orally, as you saw, again, to sort of accommodate for learners' individual preferences as well as abilities. And so after watching the video, they moved on to the writing screen and typed their text. So those were the tasks, and obviously these were developed through a process of experimenting, of piloting and revising and so on. So then the next question was, so if someone does this task, do they actually use multimodal integrated forms of processing? And to find that out, we administered the tasks to a group of English foreign language learners in Hungary who were older adolescents of a range of CFR levels, but the majority was at the B2 level, some at the C level, as measured by an APTIS test. And we administered in total 4 of the tasks, not all 6 because of time constraints and also the cognitive demands for the learners. So the 2 describe tasks, the one on contact lenses and the train, and 2 compare and contrast tasks, the one on zoos and the one on space tourism. And we did that in a counterbalance design to control for potential order effects. Then 20 of these learners we also interviewed individually after that in Hungarian. And whilst to help them recall their thought processing, we let them see the videos again. And also they had their notes that they had been taking, so to remind them how they had approached completing the task. Then we recorded those, transcribed and translated into English, and then we did qualitative coding of those data. So what did that tell us? First of all, in terms of the kinds of codes we had in the data set, there's lots of numbers here, but essentially what I want to just share with you is this, that 41% of our processing codes were about integration processes, where they were integrating different modalities. So that was a first sort of positive finding that, yes, this was not independent tasks, but there was a lot of integration going on during the processing. It's always nicer to have the test takers themselves sort of say how they were processing. So I'll share some quotes from those interviews with you. So in terms of first the visual processing of the video input and how that integrated with other modes, of course, the big question in the first place is, did they actually watch the video? Because they could have just sat down with their head down and write. But we had plenty of evidence in the data set that they had been looking. So here a test taker, for example, said about a train task, they were rotating the picture and it was so attention grabbing. So we had plenty of comments like that. It was also clear that they were combining those visuals with the oral channel, so the listening, and that combination helped their understanding. So, for example, one learner said about the train task, I didn't know this word bolster, so it was good to see it in the picture. And also when they said, for example, in the video that it should be turned, the picture turned. Without the pictures, I couldn't have imagined what it was and where it was. Or another test taker said about the space tourism task, about the 2 experts talking the hand gestures, their body language. For example, the lady, when she was saying how wonderful the view must be, she was pointing with her hands. So integrating that visual information with the oral as they were processing. We also saw plenty of evidence of listening processing and integration. And they were demonstrating a whole range of listening processes from low-level decoding to quite complex high-level comprehension. So, for example, here is evidence of phonological decoding, a student talking about the train task saying, I heard the word welded, but I didn't know the word. And then I wrote down a W and I tried letters. Or much higher level processing where they're really trying to represent the meaning of a whole section of the input, and in addition engaging and thinking further about it. Is this quote from a student about the contact lenses task, saying, I was a little shocked that there are over 140 million people in the world who wear contact lenses, which is a pretty big number. But when you think about it, it's understandable because more people than that wear glasses. We also saw that as they were watching the video, they were already thinking ahead to the writing task as well. And so, for example, they were watching, keeping in mind what kind of genre they would need to write afterwards. So a student here says, I was just writing notes while watching. I was thinking about the fun fact that was mentioned in the video. I wanted to put that in my notes because it's an article I have to write, and I did not want it to be very dry. And we also saw that note-taking is actually a tool for structuring and further processing of that input in function of the writing task. So here we have a student saying, I wrote down the two speakers' names, so those two experts, in their notes. They wrote one on the left and one on the right, and I wrote their opinions next to each of them. And somewhere I wrote that, for example, they share the same opinion, but somewhere I wrote that it wasn't quite the same. And then finally, in terms of writing processing, we saw evidence there as well from low-level processes such as lexical sophistication and diversity. So a student saying, as they had been writing, in a sentence I wrote good twice, and then I put exciting instead of good to make it more diverse. There's also higher level processing like planning for writing. Here a student says, I tried to get my thoughts together roughly and what ideas I had and how I wanted to write. So I like to put it together in my head. They were paying attention to how they organized their writing as well. And you could see that they integrated the video and the note-taking into their writing. So a student here says, if you looked at the screen, so watching the video, you could see what you could expect from that particular video frame. And then I could structure it in my notes, and that was a big help. And then those notes helped me in my essay too. And because of my notes, I could write different paragraphs. So you have this whole chain of getting structure from the video frame, then translating that into the notes, and then the notes helping them to distinguish paragraphs in their writing. But they also admitted sometimes they actually did struggle. And so when they had problems getting the meaning of the video, then it affected, for example, the coherence of their writing. So here a student reported the parts of the video that were confusing, so that that person didn't understand. I didn't know how to write them in a way that the reader can understand. What I noted down and understood from the video, I could put into words quite easily. I wrote in addition and things like that to make the text flow. But the parts of the video that I didn't understand, I felt a little bit that I didn't know what I was writing. So plenty of evidence of multimodal integratedness here. So yes, there is listening and there is writing involved. But you also see that that visual and that oral channel interact to establish meaning. We see that the visuals enable the accuracy of the content in the writing. And we see this transformation of that video input, that is necessary to actually successfully complete the task. So that's about processing. Now then, of course, they do the task and they deliver a performance in writing. So the next question, we're talking about a testing context, is how do you score these performances? And so to do that, Judith and I developed two analytic rating scales, one for each task type. Again, these are freely available. And these rating scales each had 4 criteria. The first one, viewing for writing. So that focuses on the content of the writing, so influenced by the video input. And we developed a crib sheet to help mark that, and I'll show you in a minute. The second criterion was organization and structure, so marked out of 4. The third criterion is language use, and then finally mechanics, which was weighted less heavily. So the scales looked like this. Obviously, again, these were developed through a process of drafting, redrafting, piloting, and so on. There's obviously too much information here to cover all the detail, but just to illustrate what is in this scale. So here we see the viewing to describe rating scale. So for example, for that train task, how a train carriage is made. So to get a top mark of 4 in the first criterion, viewing for writing, what we need to see in the writing is that all those relevant steps of how to produce a train carriage from the video should be represented in the writing. Those steps should be accurately described, and they should also be accurately sequenced. And so what we did in all our tasks is we controlled for how many main content points there were, 8 in this case. So you would need to have 8 out of 8 essentially in this criterion. And to help that, we also developed a crib sheet that listed for each task what those 8 content points were. So the underframe is at the bottom of the carriage. To make it, you need to weld aluminium together. Then there's bolsters and so on. So we had those listed very clearly. The other criteria, just to again give you a little bit of insight into it. So for example, for organization and structure, and I'm looking at the second rating scale for compare and contrast. There, one of the criteria descriptors, for example, is the writing needs to demonstrate fully effective signposting, including excellent use of a solid range of cohesive devices and explicit reference in order to compare and contrast those two speakers' views. So you need to make very clear he, she, they, whatever, who's talking and what is whose view, and organize it accordingly as well, your writing. An example of a language use descriptor for grammar, for example, is very high level of accuracy, wide range and high complexity, commensurate to the video input. And this is again important because the input offers a lot of language, and so you also judge this relative to the complexity of the input in the video. So we had those rating scales, and then next step was doing the actual rating. So we had 2 raters rate all the performances, and then we ran a whole series of statistical analyses. Again, there's more detail in the article. I just want to give you a flavor. So what we found was that the average score on these tasks, and so there were 4, the total was ranging between 65 and 69% if we turn that into percentage scores. So this is the mean performance. So and we saw similar means for viewing for writing and all the writing criteria. Overall, there was a spread of performances on each task, and the task interestingly operated quite similarly statistically. Principal components analysis showed us that there's one big factor that explains 69% of the variance, and the further analyses, mixed effects modeling, showed that yes, listening and writing are predictors, but that's not just the whole story. So it points to that idea again that there's a big multimodal integrated task factor where all these things interact. So then you have scores, but obviously the performances are not just numbers, they are actual texts. And so our final analysis, and this will be reported in a second article that's underway at the moment, we did some linguistic analyses, so type of cuff analyses of those discourses, the texts the students had produced. So we looked at things like the error frequency, lexical sophistication, lexical diversity, syntactic complexity, and cohesion, and using a range of tools to analyze those features. Again, we ran several stats on this. And to give you the main findings of that analysis, we found that those discourse characteristics do explain a significant amount of the variance in the two task types. And in particular, lexical diversity and accuracy factors seem to really contribute to that explanation. Not so much the cohesion measures, which was really interesting to us, but then we thought more about it, and probably this can be explained by the fact that actually our video inputs were really nicely structured from the start. And we're also dealing with a population where many are at the B2 level, so probably they have a good handle on this with very nicely structured input in the first place. So what this tells us, that these tasks were neither too easy nor too difficult for our learners who were B-level, C-level learners. And they were also able to discriminate among learners with different abilities. What it also showed us again is that, yes, listening and writing are involved, but these tasks are, for example, not just listening tasks and definitely not just writing tasks. But it seems there's a single underlying construct of multimodal integratedness rather than this being just a sequence of neatly separated modes or language skills. So we gained a lot of research information from this. Along the way, we learned a lot, of course, by experimenting with this. And so I also wanted to share with you some things we learned, some tips for designing multimodal integrated tasks, for example. So the first step is, sounds very intuitive, take a reasoned approach, start with task specifications. We can't say this enough in a way. So we sat down, Judith and I, and we brainstormed on what kind of features do we imagine these tasks to have? What would be features of the input? What would be features of the expected response? Now, of course, as we all know, task specifications or test specifications are not set in stone. So these specifications did evolve as we were going through the project. So as we were actually creating the tasks, as we were piloting them, we went back and updated the specifications and so forth until we had quite a stable set of specifications that allowed us then to develop multiple versions of the tasks. Secondly, think carefully about how you select topics, content topics for the task. And I mentioned these criteria already. The main point, I think the biggest risk is that you test background or world knowledge rather than actual processing of the input. So that's one thing to really keep in mind and be watchful for. What is really important is to keep in mind that the type of the visuals you select for your video input and how they are included in your video will actually determine whether this task ends to be a monomodal listening input or a multimodal viewing input. So our advisors use a variety of visuals in your slides. So we had content pictures, words, phrases, numbers, indicator shapes, moving animations, graphs, tables, and so on. And in the compare and contrast task, we also very consciously showed the two speakers as they were discussing, so you could see their body language as well. Another tip is use visuals that actually complement the information from the oral channel. And then also explicitly connect those visuals to your listening mode. So I don't know whether you noticed it, but the speakers in the videos say things like, let's have a look at, or in the graph here, you can see, blah, blah, blah. So in that very natural discourse, embed those directions that draw attention to the video and the visuals as well. It is a reality, though, that these kinds of tasks are complex. They are cognitively demanding for a test taker. So when we design such tasks, we need to balance the attention between those different modalities. We also want to keep the memory demands as low as possible, and we want to stimulate integration of the modes. And so what we think helped a lot to achieve that were the fact that they could play the input twice. In fact, it was set as such, and that they were allowed to take notes while watching the video. And then also that there was rich information in the video. It wasn't just a list of the main points, but there was text or information around those main points, more details, so that there is a little bit of time to process each main point. It's also important that you give your test taker a purpose for watching that video, and that in turn then will regulate and enhance the integration of those modalities. So tell them explicitly, in a way, why they're going to watch this and what they're going to watch. And also in the instructions, before watching the video, already tell them what the language function will be for the writing. So the fact that they are going to have to describe, they are going to write a report that says something about the genre. So give that information so that they watch the video with a purpose in mind. So those were some tips. We are still excited about our project, having worked on it over a couple of years with all the research and everything. So we are continuing a little bit with it. So we're in the process of developing an online toolkit for second language teachers. And we're also looking at the feasibility of AI tools for creating multimodal inputs, to what extent that is feasible, whether it makes life more difficult or less difficult. So we're in the process of experimenting with that now that AI tools are available. So that's where I will end. And yeah, I'm open to questions, and any hard questions